The Habsburgs, one of the most powerful dynasties of all time. As German kings, as emperors of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, and most recently as emperors of Austria and kings of Hungary, they shaped the course of European history for centuries. As kings of Spain, they ruled over a new world empire in which the sun did not set, a sphere of influence that stretched from North Africa and reached as far as California. A combination of artful diplomacy and ruthless power politics turned an insignificant ducal family into a world-class dynasty. The Habsburgs waged wars and made marriage alliances with the same fervor, securing their influence and tying their fortunes to the significant noble families of Europe. Sometimes they took land and titles by force, but often they were just lucky enough to outlive their rivals. From the beginning of the 13th century, the Habsburgs continuously expanded their rule from their homeland in the west of the Holy Roman Empire. They began to move east to the region of present-day Austria, then to Bohemia and Hungary. Later, large regions and nations such as the Netherlands, Burgundy, Castile, and Aragon were added. Whole nations were defined and later subsumed in the course of history. Others were ruled by the dynasty for many centuries. After the tumult of the First World War, the Habsburg Empire disappeared forever. But to this day, many countries, cities, and regions are shaped by their time within its culture. Castles and palaces, monasteries, and art collections remind us of this once so powerful dynasty. We will now travel through time to the most important locations that defined the Habsburgs. A journey that leads through more than a dozen present-day European states and back to the world more than 1,000 years ago. At the beginning of 1712, for the first time, Vienna hears the deep sound of the Josephine bell. Joseph I orders it to be cast from the ore of Turkish cannons, but dies of smallpox a few months before it is completed. Now the Pummerin, as it soon became known in the vernacular, heralded the era of Charles VI. He actually wanted to become sole king of Spain. But after the unexpected death of his brother, he returns to Vienna as emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He brings with him the Spanish court ceremonial that finds its way into the Hofburg, as well as the high Baroque creative urge to glorify himself, his family, and Catholicism. While the old Pummerin did not survive the Second World War, many of the representative, magnificent buildings of his time still shine in the splendor of days gone by. This also applies in particular to the numerous churches and monasteries along the Danube, which are caught up in the wave of Baroque transformation. The triumph over the Ottomans could not have been celebrated more magnificently. Upstream from Klosterneuburg, via Gottweig Abbey near Krems. And through the Wachau to Melk, where you will find one of the most beautiful Baroque ensembles in the world.
Melk Abbey fits perfectly into a sacred landscape that runs along the Danube. As a large abbey, Melk is of course magnificent and unmatched. And then there are the smaller churches. All of this is intended to remind travelers that they are moving through a Christian region. Of course, in the 18th century, this had a different relevance when you think of the dangers from outside.
The Imperial family has its own wing. At the end of the 200-meter-long Imperial corridor, the Marble Hall hosts secular celebrations. The ceiling fresco was created in 1731, with Pallas Athena representing prudent moderation and Hercules the necessary force, both expressing the Habsburg ideal of rule. For the builder-owner, Abbot Berthold Dietmeier, paying homage to the emperor was a religious duty.
This also has a theological background, or at least a legitimization. Romans 13, for example, is often referred to, where Paul says that we should recognize worldly authority because it has been granted or given by God. This means doing everything possible to obey this authority accordingly.
The advantages of fulfilling this duty can be proven by documents.
Of course, it was also opportune and good for the monastery to be close to the imperial family, to be on good terms with the emperor, which also ensured the existence of the institution over the centuries in terms of privileges, liberties, and so on.
Abbot and emperor, two like pitch and brimstone. One confirms divine right, the other privileges and freedoms, including the oppression of non-privileged people.
The emperor also stuck up for Abbot Berthold Dietmeier once, so to speak, when some unrest arose in Melk. At the beginning of the 1720s, there was dissatisfaction and a small letter to the emperor complaining that the abbot was here too rarely, that he made decisions too arbitrarily, did not involve the monastery, and generally continued to build beyond the monastery's means. But the emperor responded to the whole affair by telling them that they should be loyal to their abbot and by ordering the abbot to punish them accordingly.
In the High Baroque period, opulence and grandeur were paramount. The walls of a marble hall didn't have to be made of marble, nor did something need to be solid gold to shine like gold. Baroque illusion painting did the rest, adding depth and elegance to rooms. More illusion than reality, that's the impression. Melk Abbey also had and still has a lot to offer in terms of purpose and functions.
I believe that many of the functions of the monastery from the 18th century can still be found today. It is still a spiritual center. It has a grammar school, it is a local school, appropriately promoted, and also important for the country. It is scientifically active. There are social projects in Eastern Europe and in Burkina Faso. So many things are being done here that have always been mandated by this monastery.
The High Baroque flourishes under the reign of Charles VI. But at the same time, the male line of the Habsburgs dies out with him. Although his wife Elizabeth Christine gives birth to an heir in 1716, the baby dies just a few months after his birth. Despite a wine cure and pilgrimages, only 3 girls were born in the following years, only referring to the perspective of the time. A Habsburg house rule from 1703, which Charles had published 10 years later as the Pragmatic Sanction, becomes increasingly important. In the absence of male offspring, it was intended to secure the Habsburg inheritance for a daughter. But even if the Pragmatic Sanction were to be recognized without envy, his eldest, Maria Theresa, would still be denied the rights to become Holy Roman Emperor. Her future husband would have to take care of that. And so Charles VI set out early on in search of a young prince from a loyal family. He finds him in Lorraine. The chosen son-in-law is Franz Stephan, son of Duke Leopold I of Lorraine. Born in 1708 in Nancy, today an attractive university town in the Grand Est region of France, then the capital of the duchy. In the Grande Rue, the burial church of the Lorraine family and the ducal palace are reminders of the noble family, which had close ties to the House of Habsburg already long before Franz Stephan. You have to realize that up until the 18th century, Lorraine was an independent territory, an independent state that was geographically in a difficult position between France in the west and the Holy Roman Empire in the east. The Duke of Burgundy, who had conquered Lorraine, dies in the Battle of Nancy. This frees Lorraine from this Burgundian threat. But after that, the Dukes of Lorraine do everything they could to remain as neutral as possible between France and the Holy Roman Empire by entering into strategic marriage alliances. Thus, the princes and princesses of Lorraine sometimes marry Frenchmen, sometimes Austrians. This leads to dynastic alliances, but also military ones, as some Dukes of Lorraine fought alongside the Habsburgs, particularly against the Turks. Charles V of Lorraine particularly distinguished himself in the great battles in Budapest and Vienna against the Turks, while Lorraine was occupied by Louis XIV at the time. Charles V of Lorraine married a Habsburg. His son Leopold married the niece of Louis XIV. Franz Stephan now belongs to the Austrians again. The emperor brings him to the Viennese court at the age of 15 to prepare him for his task. But it's still a long way to the wedding. In 1729, Leopold I of Lorraine dies as a result of a hunting accident. Franz Stephan is forced to leave Vienna and returns to Lorraine as Duke. He rarely appears in public, and when he does, it is mainly in Lunéville. It was here, not far from Nancy, that his father had the Versailles of Lorraine built. In 1719, while construction work is still in progress, a fire breaks out here for the first time. Several fires follow.
The last fire in the castle occurred 21 years ago in 2003. A short circuit led to the mishap, a fairly common and everyday cause. Studies on the history of the castle were immediately commissioned to accompany its restoration, which began in 2008. The first areas were opened to the public in 2010. We are currently working on the restoration of the ducal apartments, which are located here in the truly historic heart of the castle, so that we can transform it back into the true Versailles of Lorraine and make the rooms look as Franz Stephan knew them in the 18th century.
The fire was a tragedy.
But it also marked the beginning of a rebirth for the Lunéville castle. You also have to look at it from a positive perspective. It led to the idea of restoring the castle to its 18th century splendor. Our region, Lorraine, is still rich in the craftsmanship that contributed to the creation of this castle. As these skills still exist today, we want to integrate them into the restoration and rebirth of the castle and make it a real showcase for the best talents that this region still has to offer.
The ducal apartments are still years away from their former glory. In the dining room, only a hole in the floor reminds one of the decadence of past times of rule. La table volante, the flying table, or the concept of sparing oneself the sight of the staff while indulging in gluttony. In 1736, the wedding with Maria Theresa can take place, but before then, Franz Stephan has to vacate Lunéville Castle. and with it the entire duchy. Louis XV, King of France, wants to prevent the Habsburgs from expanding towards Paris. He is also looking for a new home for his father-in-law, the exiled Polish king Stanislaus. Stanislaus I is therefore given Lorraine for life. And so that Franz Stefan does not come away empty-handed, he is to receive Tuscany after the death of the last Medici. This is how it is done between the families that divide Europe among themselves. Franz Stefan is packing his things. The relocation takes place in stages. Franz Stefan leaves Lorraine and takes all his movable property with him, including furniture, paintings, and even the orange trees. Everything is initially transported by ship to Brussels. After the death of the last Grand Duke of Tuscany, a Medici, everything was transported to Florence by ship. All these extremely valuable objects from the court, the items from the ducal chapel and the library, the paintings and furniture, were thus brought to Tuscany and then embarked on a final journey to Vienna, where most of them can still be found today. Franz Stefan thus takes everything with him except for his mother and leaves no lasting impression in Lorraine. Under his successor, Stanislaus I, the duchy flourishes once again before becoming part of France. This period also sees the creation of the famous Baroque classical ensemble in the heart of Nancy, which today, as Place Stanislas, is one of the most beautiful squares in Europe. Stanislaus dies in Lunéville in 1766. Once again, there is a fire in the castle. This time, it is the last Duke of Lorraine, whose robe caught fire by the open fireplace. In 1736, Franz Stefan and Maria Theresa tie the knot. The name of the abandoned duchy remains, and the old dynasty is henceforth called Habsburg Lorraine, after the new progenitor. 4 years later, Charles VI dies of mushroom poisoning. The Pragmatic Sanction comes into force in favor of Maria Theresa. The electors Frederick Augustus of Saxony and Albrecht of Bavaria, together with daughters of the House of Habsburg, refuse to recognize her. And then there is Frederick II of Prussia. He demands that Maria Theresa cede at least a small part of her empire to him and invades Silesia with his superior army at the end of 1740. It was the prelude to the War of the Austrian Succession. The surprised Austrian troops retreat to Bohemia and Moravia. Brno proves to be an impregnable Habsburg stronghold. As early as the 30 Years' War, Spielberg Castle rises above the old town, and by the middle of the 18th century had become the most important Baroque fortress in Moravia. It would also withstand Frederick II. The casemates below the castle building offer soldiers protection from artillery fire. They were later converted into a prison. The entire fortress subsequently develops into a dreaded Habsburg prison. There are already prisoners here under Maria Theresa, the most prominent being Franz Friar von der Trenck, leader of an army of mercenaries in her service, sentenced to death in 1746 for atrocities and pardoned by her in 1748 to life imprisonment at Spielberg Fortress. In his case, life only lasted little more than a year. His last wish?
Baron Trenck wanted to be buried here because he had friendly relations with the local Capuchins. They were among the few people who spoke to him during his imprisonment, visited him, and found words of comfort, which he appreciated.
On dovedl ocenit, protože se tam nudil docela v té věznici, tak dovedl ocenit každého, kdo na ně měl čas a kdo mu mohl říct si nějakou něco pro útěchu. Ale je tu pohřben proto, že to chtěl, že si přál jaksi kajícně zemřít.
And he wanted to die repentant after a life of little remorse. He was a cruel soldier, but he knew that one day he would have to stand before God and give an account.
A že se mu bude muset zodpovídat.
Brother Pacifico is one of the small minority of living monks in the Capuchin monastery in Brno.
Šťastní jsou, Pane, ti, kdo umírají ve spojení s tebou. Druhá smrt už jim nemůže uškodit a jsou navěky šťastní. Díky tobě.
By 1784, around 200 monks and lay people were buried here. An ingenious ventilation system ensures the natural mummification of the deceased. Their message to the living?
What you are, we were. What we are, you will become. The saying exists in different versions. Even here in the monastery, we have two versions, a shorter one and a longer one, but it all comes down to the same thing.
Franz Friar von der Trenck, or what remains of him, has nothing more to say. His mummy lies in a single room in the crypt. His last wish was fulfilled. The War of the Austrian Succession ends in 1748. Silesia is lost for the time being, but the pragmatic sanction is generally accepted. Even before this, Franz Stephan is crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, and Maria Theresa is crowned King of Bohemia. And as early as 1741, here in St. Martin's Cathedral in Bratislava, also as King of Hungary. At that time, the capital of Slovakia was called Pressburg and was the capital of Hungary.
Maria Theresa nastúpila.
As is well known, Maria Theresa came to power thanks to the pragmatic sanction. She faced a number of difficult foreign policy challenges because you could say that the whole world conspired against her at first. And what is wonderful is that she found recognition here in Bratislava, even though she may not have expected it. Here they waited for the arrival of the king, Adventus Regis. The king crosses the pontoon bridge that is being built over the Danube. But it is not a king. It is a woman, a young, beautiful woman who has just given birth to a child, a mother. And so she receives the Hungarian crown in the coronation temple. Well, it's such an historic moment. One might have expected resistance, but she finds acceptance here, which is very nice and why I particularly like Maria Theresa among all the monarchs who were crowned in Bratislava.
Sme čakali odpor, tak vlastne tu získava prijatie. No a čo je veľmi krásne a prečo ja mám Máriu Tereziu mimoriadne rád medzi všetkými panovníkmi, ktorí boli tuto v Bratislave korunovaní.
Franz Stephan and Maria Theresa spend some time at Bratislava Castle after the coronation celebrations. Compared to today, it has a more modest setting. It was only later that Maria Theresa had the centuries-old fortress converted into the Baroque residential castle that is now Bratislava's magnificent landmark. In Schönbrunn, just outside the city gates of Vienna at the time, a Theresian conversion also attracts everyone's attention.
Maria Theresa loved Schönbrunn in particular, even as a young girl. And there are sources to prove it. The famous hunting lodge of Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach stood here. And she then had the idea of having this hunting lodge converted into a summer residence. It was quite clear that the hunting lodge could not meet the ceremonial needs, and then also the personal needs of the imperial couple. And now the aim was to create not just a private summer residence, but a real residential palace that would also meet all ceremonial requirements. And this was also due to the fact that Maria Theresa ordered the move from the Hofburg at the first beautiful warm spring weather, which was often at the beginning of April and often stayed until November. So she wanted to stay here as long as possible. Her love for Schönbrunn is documented 1,000 times over. And Schönbrunn was also known and well observed throughout Europe as the special summer residence of the Habsburg Imperial couple.
This is Miss Eby's last interview in her role as head of the scientific department. The transition is seamless. As with the imperial couple, the palace and garden are treated separately.
Schönbrunn Palace Garden is a formal Baroque garden that was designed in the mid-18th century. Emperor Franz Stephan was particularly involved in its design. Maria Theresa herself was more interested in the building and was also very intensely involved in the decoration of the rooms. Franz Stephan, on the other hand, was very interested in botany and therefore also played a major role in the garden design, together with experts that he mainly brought with him from Lorraine. Garden architects, but also architects who submitted their suggestions to him, and he then discussed them intensively with them.
It takes more than architects and an emperor to implement this. Even today, a number of gardeners are busy maintaining the palace grounds according to historical specifications. The park covers an area of around 145 hectares, with around 75 hectares being more heavily maintained. The upper part, the forest, is a nature reserve, and only the bare minimum is done there. We have around 35 employees. We have a lot to do all year round. It starts with pruning in winter. In spring, the trees are replanted. Then we start preparing for planting at the beginning of May, after the Icemen. That's around 250,000 plants. 250,000 plants. The question of their origin leads to another section of the federal gardens and into a hidden area of the palace grounds.
Our job here in the production department of the Federal Gardens is to produce the early summer flowers for the parks of the gardens. We also have part of the botanical collection here. For example, the botanical collection of citrus plants, camellias, pelargoniums, and various other collections. In the botanical collections, we have very, very old specimens. For example, we have specimens that are up to 200 years old in the case of citrus plants. We also have very, very old plants in other botanical collections. They really do date back to the Imperial era. There is evidence of this, but some of the planting of summer flowers in the parks is also based on historical plants.
Gardening like in the days of the emperor, only more informal.
The beauty of the job is simply that you can watch the plant grow from an early age and how it then looks beautiful in the beds in summer. The planting, that you simply know that this is how it used to be and that it is historical. And unlike other gardens, we still do it from seed. So you can see the process much better than if you just buy young plants and then pot them up.
A beautiful garden, a magnificent castle, an imperial husband, and a wealth of children. The only thing missing was the reconquest of Silesia, but this first required order on the periphery. During the Turkish Wars, the Habsburgs expand to the southeast, and German-speaking settlers move into the borderlands. As early as 1723, the Wiener Zeitung reported on a sinister creature raging in these areas.
The vampire sucks power. It may suck blood, but it may also suck other fluids. It also sucks sweat. There's also this idea, for example, this idea of the returning dead, which has a damaging effect at the expense of life.
Back then, it was not yet a fictional disease of the nobility. It affects the people.
And this shows that there is actually no pattern in terms of gender. No pattern in terms of generation. Among those suspected of turning into vampires, there are children, as well as 60 to 70-year-olds. Pensioners, we would say today. What is striking is that it is always people from outside the area who are suspected.
The locals know what to do.
There are traditionally 3 measures that are considered useful in popular belief to render vampires harmless. The first is decapitation. The second is impalement of the heart, for example, piercing the heart. And the third is burning the corpse. And there was also the option of using 2 or even all 3 to be on the safe side.
In 1755, a major vampire incident occurs in the Moravian town of Hermersdorf. 19 corpses are exhumed and destroyed according to the usual practices, again in the periphery, but this time on the border with Silesia.
And it is quite exciting how Frederick II reacted to the Hermersdorf case. Namely, he tried in his media, in the Berliner Zeitung, in the Berliner Nachrichten, to use precisely this case and to portray the Habsburg monarchy as backward, as superstitious, in order to present his Silesian War, his Silesian conquest, as a civilizing mission.
Maria Theresa also reacted. Her personal physician Gerhard van Swieten assures her with an enlightened expert opinion that vampirism stems from a barbarism of ignorance, and so she issues a decree ordering that superstition be put to an end.
With this vampire decree, Maria Theresa expressly wanted to ensure that the court or courtly society had control over the discourse, including vampirism. They explicitly professed the Christian faith. They professed belief in miracles. They believed in them, but not in superstition, not in magia potuman, not in the dark side of all these phenomena. However you define this, you would of course have to ask, but these practices of popular belief should be explicitly eliminated.
The Enlightenment frees her from the vampires, but otherwise remains largely alien to her. Frederick II gains the upper hand in the 7 Years' War, and Silesia is lost for good. This is not the only bad news that Maria Theresa receives in the 60s of the 18th century.
The death of Franz Stephan in 1765 was truly one of the heaviest blows of fate for Maria Theresa. Although a few years before that, I always call it the so-called smallpox epidemic, had already broken out in the family. and continued until 1767. She lost several children, a total of 3 of her own children, 2 daughters-in-law, and then Franz Stephan, who died of a heart attack. She plunged into a depression, and then there was her loneliness, which was also due to the fact that she had married off almost all of her surviving children during this decade, who left for foreign courts and almost never came back. So suddenly she was sitting in the big palace, which had once been one of the busiest in the whole of Europe, and then she planned to have a widow's apartment designed here on the first floor, which was painted with landscape paintings by the artist Johann Wenzel Bergel. Illusion paintings that documented Maria Theresa's preference for all things exotic. She called it all Indian because it came from the East. It was exotic, and these 4 rooms in her apartment are entirely painted with exotic landscapes and the development up to the Baroque garden.
Bergel brings color into her gray everyday life, and the garden into the house. Only later does she turn her attention back to the one outside her windows. The Gloriette is finally built.
The Baroque palace was built around 1700 by Johann Bernhard Fischer von Erlach, and he had already planned a belvedere, a lookout building, on the opposite Schönbrunn hill. However, it was never realized as long as Franz Stephan lived. And when Franz Stephan died, Maria Theresa actually wanted to leave the palace park, which was not quite finished at the time, as it was, and had no further interest in it, because she often said as a widow, it was not her place to invest a lot of money in garden design, even though she had always known that her late husband was very fond of this topic. And she was only persuaded to do so by State Chancellor Wenzel Anton Prince Kaunitz Riedberg, who brought her to the point where the park was actually completed. This meant that sculptures were erected that had not existed before, that there were more fountains, and that the palace was given a representative counterpart.
She takes the carriage to the Gloriette, but if Her Majesty wants to go higher, she changes the means of transport.
There has always been a viewing terrace on the roof of the Gloriette, and it has always been accessible. And so that Maria Theresa, in her advanced age and suffering from breathing problems, could also reach it, an elevator was installed for her. However, there were also elevators in various residences. In both the Hapsburg and Schönbrunn, Maria Theresa had elevator machines so that she could be spared the tedious task of climbing stairs.
Maria Theresa spent her last summer here in 1780. She dies of pneumonia after moving to the Hofburg. Her son Joseph II, emperor since 1765, is now the sole ruler and has free reign for his reforms. He was polarizing during his lifetime and is still subject to varying evaluations today.
My personal opinion is that I am an absolute fan of Joseph II. Not only did he create this great medical district with the first general hospital, the Fool's Tower, the Garrison Hospital, the Josephinum, to name the most important components, but he also actually created religious freedom through the patents of toleration. He banned serfdom, to name just a few of these things. And I think that many people didn't understand him that well, because he was actually ahead of his time.
What looks like a city palace from the outside is actually home to a milestone in medicine.
The Josephinum, which bears the emperor's name, was intended as a surgical academy to improve the training of surgeons. who up to that point were not academics, but barbers, you could say. And in doing so, Joseph brought the surgeons up to the same level as the doctors. And it was the beginning of modern medicine as we know it, and of modern training.
The methods are revolutionary, the means artful.
Very important are the teaching aids, the anatomical wax models, which Joseph II knew from Florence and which he ordered there, and which came over the Alps on mules in about 1,200 pieces. They have been here in the house since around 1785. They were certainly one of the most important teaching aids, because here you could see the body in 3D, so to speak. And of course, a surgeon had to have a good knowledge of human anatomy.
It is only a short way from the teaching resources of the Josephinum to the fine arts and to a composer who finally obtains a position at the imperial court. As early as 1762, he performed for Maria Theresa as a boy wonder. After her death, he returned to Vienna and was later appointed court composer by Joseph II. Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart is now officially responsible for the carnival dances at the imperial masked balls in the Redutenzele. His part-time activities outlive him and enhance Vienna's reputation as a city of music, which is still a reason for some people to settle here today. In any case, history has a great significance here in the city, and especially in music. For example, when I can go to concerts that take place in original venues. For example, where the concerts were premiered. For example, in some palace. And that's something you rarely have, I think, in any other city. Like Mozart or Beethoven, most violin makers come from abroad. Vienna, as in many respects, is always a mixture of incomers. And the big names in violin making in the 18th and 19th centuries also come from Fusen in the Allgäu. That was the largest and oldest violin-making center in Europe. Mittenwald is not far away. This is where Kai von Stietenkron learned his trade. In the middle of the city of Vienna, he has created a place where time seems to stand still. That's my biggest concern, to create a space that radiates this atmosphere, and also for me as a worker, that gives me this atmosphere of peace and being in the moment, and not being constantly distracted in any way. That's the most important thing for me. Mozart rarely gets to rest. On December 5th, 1791, at the age of 35, he dies of severe miliary fever, as noted by his doctor. The legend that he received a pauper's funeral the following day and was buried in a mass grave in bad weather can be refuted. On the one hand, there is the Barleybalk, the burial record of St. Stephen's Cathedral Parish.
And from this entry, we can see that Mozart received a so-called third-class funeral, a funeral that 4 out of 5 Viennese ordered for themselves at the time. In other words, a bourgeois funeral that cost 8 guilders, 56 kreuzer, the equivalent of around 2,000 euros. However, the funeral ceremonies were rather simple, in accordance with late Josephine regulations. Mozart's body was then buried quietly in a shaft grave in the cemetery at St. Mark's. A shaft grave is not a mass grave, but is the term for the 3 burials that took place on that day. For example, the 3 deceased who were buried next to each other in this grave. And it was also not customary to mark the gravesite.
On the other hand, there is the matter of the weather.
There are weather records from the Hohe Warte here in Vienna from this time, and they say that December 6 was a sunny, albeit cool, winter's day. In other words, the stories surrounding Mozart's funeral, from the burial of the poor to the bad weather, are what we in Vienna call Geschichtelen.
Mozart's burial complies with the Josephine fashion, which resolutely rejected funeral pomp and recognized progressive inventions such as the reusable folding coffin. In 1790, Joseph II dies of tuberculosis. In accordance with his wishes, he too receives a simple burial. His simple wooden coffin is only later placed in the zinc coffin that now stands in front of his parents' double ceremonial sarcophagus in the Capuchin crypt in Vienna. Soon after his death, the Habsburgs returned to the pomp funèbre, and the Viennese were once again able to enjoy the beautiful corpse. Joseph's brother succeeds him on the throne as Leopold II. He is perhaps the ruler who best manages the difficult balancing act between Enlightenment and absolutism. After the death of his father, he moves to Florence and becomes Grand Duke of Tuscany, which he transforms into a model state with his reform policies. In 1786, the Grand Duchy sets a milestone in civilization and becomes the first country in the world to abolish the death penalty. Leopold probably wouldn't have minded staying in Florence to further develop his ideas for a constitutional monarchy in the Palazzo Pitti. But family duty is calling him back to absolute power. The Habsburg expert Simon Winder has nothing but praise for this, too.
Yes, fascinating, because here was someone who really knew what they were doing, and he unexpectedly takes over because of Joseph's death. But here was someone with lots of experience, a lot of intelligence, a very practical, and one of the very few Habsburgs who seems to have relished ruling in a thoughtful way. And it was sort of a disaster that his reign was such a short one, because he had carried on. You could see how the response to the French Revolution could have been a genuinely intelligent and interesting one. But he turned out to be a dead end, sadly. Well, literally.
Just 1.5 years after the imperial coronation, Leopold II dies, presumably of pneumonia. The brief progressive phase of the dynasty comes to an abrupt end. At least the Habsburgs were spared a revolution, with the exception of Leopold's sister, Maria Antonia. In 1770, at the age of 14, she is married off by Maria Theresa in Versailles and becomes Marie Antoinette. She is executed in Paris in 1793. The reformist Emperor Leopold II is succeeded by his son, Emperor Franz II, in 1792. He was to be the last emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. In a backward-looking logic, Franz takes refuge in the idolization of the good old days. In Laxenburg in Lower Austria, far away from the intrusions of the world, he had the Franzenfeste built as his refuge. His knight's castle is a bizarre place where ancestor worship and self-aggrandizement dominate. While Franz plays the noble knight and entertains his guests with tournaments and parlor games, the empire is overrun. When the so-called Battle of the Three Emperors took place at Austerlitz in 1805, he stayed at home, unlike Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I. the Austro-Russian alliance suffers a decisive defeat. The Spielberg fortress in nearby Brno falls into the hands of the French without a fight. Less than a year later, the Holy Roman Empire is history. But Franz had already made provisions and founded a new empire. He abdicates as Roman German Emperor Franz II and opens the final chapter of the Habsburgs as Franz I, Emperor of Austria.